theology nerds. This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity. Since the year of 2008, we've been bringing you ideological goodness so you can brew your own faith. And today, returning to the podcast is Andy Root. That's right, Andrew Root, practical theologian extraordinaire at Luther Seminary. He is back to talk about the final volume of his trilogy, engaging the work of Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor. That's right. He has processed the work of Taylor with the questions coming from ministers in some profound and challenging ways. We're going to talk about that here, and you're going to say, oh, Trip, thank you so much for bringing Andy Root back on. And I'm going to say, yeah, it is good, isn't it? You know what would be even better? What if this summer Dr. Root and I spent 6 weeks digging in to Charles Taylor and Rosa, who you'll hear about as well, another kind of philosopher of culture. That's what we're going to do. All you have to do is go to OurSecularAge.com, and you can sign up to join the reading group. You go to OurSecularAge.com, sign up, and it is a pay what you can. So, you know, if you're a minister and joining this and are excited, we're having a reading group geared towards those in ministry, and you have continuing ed funds, you can use that. If you're in a church and they've been struggling during COVID and you know, you don't have the financial ability to donate, then just join anyway, because the goal is to kind of have you know, during the summertime, the off season for mainline Protestants, you could say, for to have a community of people wrestling with these big thinkers and the big challenges facing our world. That's right. I'm sure you'll hear more about it as it gets nearer, but we're also doing a giant book giveaway right now. 2 of them, to be exact. We're giving away a whole bunch of Catherine Keller books and a whole bunch of Taylor, Rosa, and Root books. So go to tripfuller.com, click on the giveaway thing, or you can go to like Facebook or Twitter or wherever on the interwebs you want to find me, and you'll find links to the giveaways. Go to OurSecularAge.com to join the class. Make sure you check out this new book trilogy from Dr. Root. But yeah. And if you want, you can become a member of the Homebrewed community. Go to homebrewedcommunity.com. But right now, I want to jump into this conversation. Andy Root and I, and we're joined by a friend of mine, Kep. Kep is in the middle of his D-Min project, Doctor of Ministry project, which I've been, you know, a part of that process with him. We're friends, and it's deeply connected to Charles Taylor and Andrew Root's work. So I said, come on, Kep, get on here. Yeah, he's doing his D-Min at McAfee School of Theology at Mercer University in Georgia. And yeah, here he is. He's joining me for the conversation. Enjoy.
Hello, everybody. This is Trip. And today on the podcast, we have the return visit of the one and only Andrew Root. You know why? Not just because I like him, and he's a nice guy and inappropriately smart, but because he wrote a book called The Congregation in a Secular Age, and it's kind of like I wanted to talk to him about this book just so I could ask him questions that I wish I had a friend that had read the books he read that he talks about in this book to then talk about the nature of the congregation. And so I didn't have to write this book, and I get to have him on the podcast. So that's pretty awesome. Oh, come on, Andy.
What am I supposed to say something?
No.
I'm just watching. I'm watching you not say anything and thinking this is the longest I've ever seen Trip not have something to say.
Oh no, I was going to keep going, and then you gave me this weird look, and I was like,
"Oh, really? No."
And I just thought I'm going to see how long I can hold a pause, and then you held it longer, and I was like, well, once I knew I had to edit it out, I was just like, whatever. But anyway, this is the third book in a trilogy exploring Charles Taylor and all his friends. So maybe a place to jump in is for you to tell us what the book trilogy itself is exploring, and what you are wanting to do in turning specifically to the congregation in this one.
Yeah, I mean, I wish that I had a logic that was stronger on how these three books kind of fit together. Other than there is a conversation of Taylor throughout them, but it's like the first volume is faith formation, and the second is kind of the pastor or pastoral identity, and then the third one is the congregation. I mean, I really thought I was going to write like a full blown ecclesiology with the third one, and it ended up to not be that. So it's more the congregation than the church. But what I'm ultimately trying to do throughout all of them is, I guess, mine Taylor for pastoral ministry, but really mine Taylor descriptively. Like, why is it hard to pass on faith to the next generation? We always think it's just, can we get them really involved, and that will do it, and try to say, no, there's a deeper reality, or why it's so hard, why it feels maybe so hard to be a pastor. And then this third one continues that theme. Why is it just hard to lead a congregation? Why is congregational life feel fraught sometimes? But then it's also kind of moving beyond Taylor a little bit and opening up a deeper dialogue with some of, as you said, some of his friends, some of the other kind of social theorists and sociologists have been working from him, is kind of where I go. So, yeah, I mean, this one a little bit less than the other two. The other two kind of break down, and like Taylor, part one is descriptive, and part two is trying to give a theological take on those. And this one does that too, but some of the more social theory and kind of theological conversation around modernity, I guess, a little bit got a little more bloated. Maybe that in a good way got more bloated. And so there is a kind of theological conversation in the last three chapters, but yeah, that's where this tries to go.
Well, maybe it'd be good to kind of set up the challenge you see Taylor's depiction of the secular age, and then the other theorists you're engaging with. Like, if you were sitting down with ministers who haven't read contemporary social theory, and then they're like, oh my goodness, I went to seminary, that was already enough of a stretch. If I can't get this in a 5-minute YouTube clip, I'm already getting overwhelmed. It sounds like a bunch of Europeans or Canadians, which is basically a European.
Right, yes.
What is it that social theory is doing, and how does it become a resource for thinking about the life of the body of Christ?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting, because I think there probably could be a critique here that this is like a little bit too Euro, or like I've watched too much Bundesliga, or like the English, the EPL or something, and have got too enamored with it, or too much Montreal hockey with Taylor. But the kind of YouTube clip kind of piece that I always kind of go back to is that really, and I think is really helpful for Protestants, particularly though Taylor's a Catholic, is this sense that what it means to live in a secular age is, first of all, that the secular is a very multivalent word, and we're kind of confused on what we think it is. And so if you threw 50 pastors in a room and you said, part of our struggle is is secularity, or is the secular, right? Everyone would nod their head. But then if you could actually get them to describe what they meant by the secular, there'd be a lot of different kind of understandings of it, or there'd be some kind of overlap, but a lot of difference. And I think the way we tend to think about it in Protestantism is in this kind of dead end level that Taylor talks about as the secular two perspective, where we tend to think of the secular as fewer and fewer people going to church. And that's what we kind of feel like's the problem with faith formation. Is it just that young people or all people don't want to be part of this? Part of the struggle of being a pastor is that, you somehow have to convince people who have all sorts of other things to do and that seem more interesting to go to church. And if you're a congregation, the big issue is that you're just losing resources, that you are losing people as resources, but you're also losing money. And the denomination has less resources. So we need to somehow kind of innovate to get more resources. And I think what's really helpful about Taylor is that he wants to describe the secular not in that framework, that he thinks that may be an issue. And particularly for those of us talking here and those of us who are listening to this podcast, I mean, if you're the pastor of a church and trying to make budget, like that's an issue. Or, you're the dean at a seminary, like that's a huge issue, the way that we've lost some of those resources. But he ultimately doesn't think that's what it means to live in a secular age. And the secular age for him is this kind of contesting of belief, for what he calls the fragilization of belief, or just the kind of loss of transcendence as a referent that gives our lives any meaning. And so it becomes a very a very different sense of what the congregation's for inside this kind of loss of transcendence, or this fragilization of belief, becomes a very different way of having to kind of think about the church, or think about faith formation, or think about pastoral identity. So that's kind of where I pick it up and find it really deeply interesting.
One of the observations, Taylor makes is like how so much has shifted in 500 years, like how the question of God shifted from obviously to, well, I don't know, maybe it's an elective for me. So when you think of in part one of the book, the nature of the congregation, you talk about the depressed congregation, and one of the fascinating things for someone like yourself that does a lot of work in youth work, if you weren't in the church 30 years ago, you have no idea what a church starting to, shake off Christendom looks like. And you don't understand where the anxiety comes from because you've never gone to a school where everyone just believed, right? Like where that was just like a common assumption. So when you're thinking of this particular moment and the way congregations are thinking about their identity in relationship to culture, how do you describe it? Because I feel like every congregation at different places in different parts of the country, it's at a different, shift, right? Like a mainline Protestant culture in Los Angeles has had multiple generations of being post-Christian. But in the South right now, there are plenty of congregations that this is their first generation that has had that as a live option. Like what does that congregation where you see those multi-generation shifts around secularity or secular three type of shifting, how do you describe that?
Yeah, well, particularly, I mean, you kind of pointed to it at the beginning of your question that I think is important. It seems like whether you're kind of third generation down the road here or first generation, that there is a certain kind of level of anxiety. Maybe younger people don't have that anxiety, but particularly older people and clergy and church professionals have that anxiety. And I think we do kind of conclusively, I mean, I say that with a little doubt, but I think we conclusively believe like the church needs to change. Like no one, I don't think, maybe a couple generations ago, or maybe particularly a generation ago in the South or something, people have been like, oh, the church doesn't need to change. But for the most part, maybe there are a few communities that aren't like this, but for the most part, every denominational structure across the continuum, at least in the States, kind of feels like we need to change. Like change is really important and we better change. But what's, I think, pretty ironic, and we tend to see it only as irony, is that right at this moment where change is possible and a lot of the bureaucratic structures and others are open for trying new things and changing, all of a sudden it feels like there's no energy left to make that change. And I think we tend to interpret that as just bad timing. Like, oh, here it was. We had the opportunity to change, and then the church was too exhausted to change. And one of the things I'm trying to do in the first half of the book is actually say, no. Those things are related. Like a kind of dumb analogy I use is like if you got the flu, if you had tickets to your favorite concert and got the flu, you would think, well, that's bad luck. Like you would never think the tickets to the concert gave you the flu. You know what I mean? Unless you were really a crazy person around the coronavirus, you wouldn't believe those things are related. But I think they are related. And I think we kind of feel the same way. Like this isn't related. It's just that as soon as we have the chance to change, we found ourselves without the energy to change. I actually think this necessity of somehow innovating ourselves into a new way of being church exhausts people. And I think it is this kind of sense of how we think of the self and how we have to curate the congregation that plays into this, that there is a certain kind of depressive category. And I don't mean this like the individuals are depressed as much as like the whole system becomes depressed, because the way innovation kind of works, or the way change, especially the kind of way we think about it in this kind of innovative move that the congregation needs to make, is that once you make a certain change and innovation, it means that the next year you have to change again. Like it becomes a never ending treadmill. And the measure of actually doing well is a very secular two kind of play card. So it's always, do you have more resources? So, oh man, we've seen 8, 10, 12% growth in people participating in our Sunday service. Well, that also means that next year you need to see another at least 10% growth. And it just becomes, I think, exhausting. So most people in congregations want the church to change, but most Protestant congregations, to change means that you're going to have to do more. Like you're going to have to give more. You're going to have to help run some of these programs if that's what we're going to do, or whatever kind of missional initiative we come up with. It means you're going to have to do more. And I think people are really teetering right on the edge of being exhausted, as for multiple different kind of cultural reasons. So that I think our congregations are kind of in a depressive state where they do want to change, but the idea of the energy it will take to change feels overwhelming.
And that description is something that you could also apply to most adults in a neoliberal economy and most families, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, one of the things that I'm drawing on is this, and I'm going to probably butcher his name because it doesn't sound very Parisian, but this like Parisian sociologist wrote this book called, I think in English it's called something like the wariness of the self, but it, like the direct French translation is more insightful. And if you kind of translate it directly, which my French sucks, so it would be awesome if I could say it right now, because then I would sound so romantic and I would get emails asking me to speak French to them. But the direct French translation is like the fatigue of being yourself. And it's a genealogy. It's this guy by the name of Alan Ehrenberg, which probably is a better French way of saying it. But he's giving a genealogy of depression. And he thinks that like this time of neoliberalism, really like 70s and on, he actually thinks modernity always has kind of an inherent kind of mental illness issue that kind of comes to the fore, that it kind of pushes forth. And in late modernity, it becomes depression. And the depression is that you have the freedom, but also the burden of always having to curate yourself and feeling like you need to keep up on curating the self. And part of kind of the depression that he's kind of getting at is this kind of sense that you just can't, you're too fatigued, you're too tired to keep curating the self. And this kind of malaise comes over you. So it's really a kind of interesting genealogy of Prozac and how like medications have come into the system. So there's no connection of Prozac and congregational life, but maybe that's a direction people need to go. But but it's every adult, exactly.
But you don't need Prozac if you have the Holy Spirit. So I don't know if you knew that. Maybe. Yeah,
well, that's where the book ends, and that's where it ends.
There's a prayer that if you buy the book in hardback, that's right. The one that has the prayer that fixes everything.
I should have said that there's a link at the end of the book that you click, and then you put your credit card in, and then you get the prayer. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so on this call, there's also a friend of mine, Ket Pate, who is an all-star youth minister, like has been at multiple large churches, very successful at it, and is doing a D-Min project where he because he has a small theological crush on you. I was told him I was going to interview about this, and he has all these comments and questions and ideas, and I'm like, whoa, you should come hang out on the internet. Now, he and I've had this conversation, and he convinced me that a youth minister in a churches that he's serving, right, ones that see the success of the youth ministry so tied to their institutional identity and the success of the next generation, and then the parents that choose the successful church with the big youth ministry, like the observational point he's in is one that sees all this going on and has the biggest temptation and budget to deny it. So what I'm hoping is I want him to convince everyone that's listening that you're not exaggerating the problem, and maybe y'all talk back and forth to play out the situation as to how this takes place and what it looks like in congregations. So he can give examples from places he's served and, without being too specific, and then y'all can kind of like play it back and forth.
Sounds great.
Well, Trip, I'm really happy that for everyone listening and really the church at large, we can finally put the myth to rest that, in fact, success in youth ministry is the size of my congregation and or steeple.
Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord.
The lives and narratives and resonance of grandparents and babies is really irrelevant in deciding who is best. I've done youth ministry in a handful of places. Shameless plug. If you read Andy's book, The End of Youth Ministry, ? The white upper class, middle upper class youth ministry that you use argue to kind of defines the trends and narratives of youth ministry. That is unashamedly my home. That's where I have grown up and done professional ministry as well. Andy, one thing are we cool enough that I can call you Andy?
Absolutely.
Sweet. one thing I've kind of noticed in reading your work and then reading the work that you kind of list in the biography and footnotes is there's this fatigue of self of always trying to catch up to your own self. You're running on your own hamster wheel and you can't keep up of the brand you curate as an individual. But as a youth pastor, I think the bigger burden on students and teens is not the brand that they curate from themselves of, tongue in cheek, I'm the football player, I'm the cheerleader, I'm the skater dude, but having to navigate the curated identities of their peers and to associate or recognize the identity of the other, which in the age of authenticity, if you've defined, we are morally obligated to recognize the identity of the other, then imposes an identity on themselves. A lot of the anxiety and tension I see in youth ministry is youth are having to choose between having this moral freedom, their quote, God-given right to determine what it means to be human for them or to be the best version of themselves, or recognize the identity of the other and fulfill their moral obligation. Coming out of election season, an easy example of that is, if I'm red or blue and my neighbor affiliates with the other political party, I have a choice to maintain my identity of my political identity or recognize the other, but then be painted with the same brush. And I'm really curious what your thoughts are on that bleeding over to this depressed congregation you speak of how fatigued the church is from having to continually pivot and position itself to recognize these other identities at the speed of modernity.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question and a great point. And there's a couple things that I think about that relate to this book and maybe relate to some other things that I've been thinking a lot about. But I think you're right that a lot of young people feel both this incredible reflex that they get to decide what it means for them to be human, and yet this is kind of Taylor's point, is that yes, that freedom is there and there is this ethic of authenticity, but he, for his kind of sense of being a language animal, he never thinks you can really come up with an identity by yourself, so we do have this kind of illusion, I think, that young people, or all of us, get to kind of sit down in our room, maybe an 11 or 12-year-old gets to watch some YouTube videos, and then at some point they get to say, this is me. Like, I figured out who I am. Like, this is a complete internal journey to kind of construct my own identity for myself. And Taylor particularly just thinks, well, that's great that we can kind of think that way and that we do have a freedom of that, and that we've moved away from generations of people who would even start to have that sensibility and then feel like shamed for it. That's great that we moved to that direction. But let's also not fool ourselves that you always need some kind of dialogue partner. You need some kind of point of discourse to really figure out who you are, which is why still, like, middle school is a haunting thought for most of us who are, decades out of it, or it's still a kind of cultural touch point of something that's horrible. Remember how horrible middle school was, even coming out of an age of authenticity, because it usually is the time where you started a dialogue, like you wore those jeans or those shoes and you said, this is me. And then you got direct feedback on that. So there's always a sense of recognition. And particularly, like, in this time, this is what Taylor talks about as the politics of recognition, that there has to be a sense where we feel like we're recognized by others. And I think what happens with young people who they want to feel like they have a self that is somewhat aware of the world and is not completely just turned in on itself, that they then kind of get pulled into, they have to be this kind of self they want to curate and be, though, like you're saying, they don't even get a lot of time to think about what that is. They also have to do the game of the politics of recognition and be able to recognize these other identities so that they can feel like a self who has this kind of identity. And I think that one of the things that's really interesting, kind of as we think about even our political moment, and as Tripp kind of referenced, like Charles Taylor and all his friends, is the major dialogue partner I'm in with this book is to kind of, through Taylor, pivot to this German social theorist named Hartmut Rosa. And Rosa's building off Taylor. So he thinks like Taylor, all human beings are kind of pushed by some kind of implicit or explicit sense of what's good, in that they want to live a good life. So there's a similar kind of social theory there that he's building off. But Rose's real contribution is to see modernity as things speeding up. And so he thinks everything speeds up in modernity, and it just continues to speed up in modernity. But usually, especially within the church, we almost always just get caught in one level of speeding up, and we usually just think of it all as technology. Like, what speeds up is technology. So we have so many books, on how the church needs to catch up to this technological age, and here we are now in a pandemic, and now we finally get to be doing Zoom church or whatever it might be. That there's always a kind of technological speed up, but he thinks that's only one dimension, and the second dimension of the speed up is social change, that things just socially change very quickly. And I think that's part of in the third one, he thinks is just the pace of our lives just keeps speeding up, which is, I think, in some ways the most fascinating one, because that's what imposes the depression, is that you just feel like you cannot keep up to the pace of your life. But I think the second one's really interesting on your point, is that the dynamic of social change that's happened thanks to digital technologies and other things has just been really exponential. Like, I think back to what Steve Carell just said a couple of years ago. They asked him, we're going to throw millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in his lap and be like, reboot The Office. Like, just reboot The Office. Let's do it. And his point, because he's now, a successful actor who makes sad movies, he said no. And one of the things he said is, I just don't think Michael Scott's jokes would work in this cultural climate. Like, they work as a kind of piece from 2010 that you can still stream on Peacock now or Netflix or whatever. But they wouldn't work necessarily as a kind of contemporary text, because all of his jokes cross social boundaries that we don't affirm anymore. And he would just, be outed on Twitter all the time. And that's a pretty quick, change. I don't know, when did The Office end? Like 2015 or something? And, within 5 years, it starts crossing all these moral boundaries. So I think young people in this kind of accelerated modernity that Rosa talks about do feel almost right on the cusp of so much social change. And there is a sense of wanting to be a good person, or at least have some kind of sense that you're living a good life. And that does mean identifying and doing the kind of politics of recognition. Which, again, we have to remember, where Taylor wants to go is he always wants to say there are gains here. We shouldn't belittle that. We should be really happy that we've moved more towards authenticity, that we do recognize that there is a kind of recognition that's necessary to live a good life. But it also then does impose different ways of seeing the world and seeing ourselves, and does do some things that are conundrums that we have to deal with. And I think this is a conundrum young people have to deal with, is they, like you're saying, don't even have time to really think about who they really are, because they always want to make sure they're kind of on the right side of history, or whatever that would mean, that they're always kind of affirming who they need to affirm, and not really even sure what they think. But it's all driven by, you get to be whoever you want to be.
Kep, one of the things that came up in our previous conversations is how parents, especially grandparents, and definitely those who love the church as it already is, imagine the faith being handed off successfully like they experienced it, right? Most people end up taking divinity school classes with Andy, where the ones who thought youth group was the greatest thing of all time, and then had their calling, or had the greatest campus minister, right? The ones that get advanced in church life and in the church are ones that the previous instantiation of the church really worked for. And then you're asking them to give the gift to the next generation when they aren't the ones with the same existential challenges of the secular age. I'm interested in what your experience kept in reading Andy's work, and then the different theorists he's engaging with. How would you describe that back to us? And then maybe Andy could unpack it, and then talk about how the particular theorists and things that he's working with frame that conversation in a way we recognize both the blessing and the curse of having really connected with the gospel in a particular time, space, and situation, how that changes our vision for ministry.
Well, I'm really loving the Bauhaus effect we're having right now of the craftsman and the artist, where I get to tell someone how to make a pot, and then Andy gets to tell them how to make it pretty. For the 3 people that listen to this podcast that get that reference, I want to be your friend. But Trip, what's hilarious is as you were saying that, I got this put in my mailbox today at the church. It is a list of youth initiatives and activities from 1964 to 1967, talking about all the great things that this youth group, which was massive in the 60s, did. It was youth choir, youth week. I'm at a Baptist church, so there was GAs and RAs, not RAs like in college, but never mind.
Royal ambassadors.
Yes.
Because Southern Baptists never had a problem appropriating imperial imagery for their agenda.
Yeah. And as Tripp has so eloquently put it, for everyone listening and for Andy, I am a wet Baptist. And if you know what that means, then you're in the inner circle. So yeah, no, there's this huge tension in youth ministry of trying to go back or to rewind or to go to kind of slow down, which Andy does a really great job in this book, which everyone should buy twice, of describing this urge to slow down because that'll fix it. And I think something really important to note of the generation trying to pass the baton or to pass the torch is almost every generation in the church, even the better half of millennials, a significant portion of their formative years came at a slower time. You know, I was born in 1990. The iPhone came out when I was a senior in high school. So yes, I grew up in this accelerated age, but nothing near to what the youth of today are doing. And I think the struggle of handing off the faith of old or the faith of the past is, to my age and everyone older in the church, we see this acceleration. There was normal, life has sped up, and if we can balance this speed up and accumulate enough resources, and lean into what Harmont Rosa calls the AAA, then eventually we will get back to that normal. We will get back to 1990 or whatever that mile marker is for you. And the youth of today have no sense of that normal. You know, in the book, The Art of Deceleration, Harmont Rosa has an interview in there, and he talks about, you know, we're reaching the point where this acceleration it's going to combust. It cannot be sustained. You can only continue to speed up to a certain point. And an analogy I use when I talk to other youth workers is like college football coaches' payroll. You know, at some point, we're going to have to stop increasing the payroll for college football coaches, that this swirling upward just cannot be sustained. And Dabo Swinney can't make $1 billion a year. It just doesn't work. So
Especially
I think
if he loses to Notre Dame.
He lost to Notre Dame with a backup quarterback, 3 starters missing on defense.
He's a Clemson alum.
I did go to Clemson. But I will humbly admit Trevor Lawrence was not going to win that game for us. Notre Dame was going to score every time they touched that football. No, but I think the struggle with older generations trying to hand off the faith is that there's this illusion that we're going to return to a slower time. We're going to return to a sacred time. We're going to return to whatever it is it is. And, you know, when I was growing up, that was a struggle because we weren't nostalgic about it, even though we experienced it. But today's youth don't even know what that was. They didn't experience it. So I think, and Andy's book, The Relational Pastor, is a really good explanation of this. When we made this shift from people to programs, we lost the ability to hand off the faith to the next generation. And Andy, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And you kind of bring it up in this book of when we get to the volunteer society and Bonhoeffer's thing of a zombie congregation. but the church is going to have to realize that it was the people and not the programs that sustained it. And handing off a program list to the next generation isn't going to continue the faith tradition as they wish it would.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I think I'm not a math person, but like Rosa does this thing where he talks about, and this is kind of your thing about neoliberalism too, I think, Tripp, is that the way that the kind of like inner logic, or even before we started recording, we were talking about algorithms, and like the inner logic of late modernity, of Western late modernity, is this kind of sense of like X times Y equals like X squared or whatever. So, you take commodity money, times commodities equals money squared. Like, or you think of the research university, and it's like research or knowledge plus research equals research squared. I'm screwing up the equation here, but you get the point. Is that there's always needs to be some kind of squaring or priming. You need to exponentially grow this thing, and I think that's deeply kind of within our consciousness. And Tim Suttle has this little nice book called Shrink, about how kind of moving the church, thinking of it instead of a congregation trying to grow, shrink it. But one of the most haunting stories in it is he tells this story about a congregation in his community that raised $5 million so that they could build an overpass from the freeway to the church parking lot, because they kind of realized there was no way for them to exponentially grow members, to kind of like do the members plus programs equals members squared. They couldn't do that unless they could get people out of the parking lot in 20 minutes. So they spent $5 million capital campaign and probably a lot of money, like in political capital, to be able to rework the freeway system so it would go like right by their church or whatever. But that is the kind of equation that's still embedded in people's minds, I think, is that members plus programs equals more members in this kind of sense. And so you get this letter in your box of like, look at 19, what did you say it was, 64 to 67 or whatever it was. And you also, like, for Tripp's way younger than I am, but like totally, shame me for how old I am when you're like, I was born in 1990. And I was like, yes, I was in 11th grade in 1990. There is this kind of sense where people want to slow down, or they want to go back where those programs could be funded both financially but also energy wise. You know what I mean? Like, they want to get back to that roster, and part of it is they think that's what made their churches great. Like, make our churches great again, bring a bunch of program spaces back. And what we're actually discovering is that, I don't have a ton of research on this, but it seems like, it feels right, that pastors are actually being asked to do more now than they ever have before. In other words, like, people still want a lot of programs, even though there's a lot less, but a lot of people they just don't have time to give a lot of time to keep those going. So you're actually having to raise more money to fund part-time or half-time or quarter-time staff to run programs that you used to run before. But a lot of those people who want those roster of 1964 to 1967 programs also feel too exhausted to be part of it. So there's a certain sense of, they think, what is a good congregation, or what does a good congregation look like? It's a very busy congregation. That a good church is a busy church. And it is a weird kind of reality for us that it appears like middle-class, late modern people who are over busy tend to be attracted to busy things, So busy people go to busy churches, which you would think you could kind of make a logical assumption it could be the opposite. Like, people who are overly busy would want to go to a church where they could meditate and pray and maybe be taken through the liturgy. But usually only those kind of people are people who grew up with that. But if they grew up with something else, they're looking for a fast-paced church. But the reality is that once these fast people go to a fast church and they get overwhelmed, they leave the church. That the church doesn't actually sustain them in any significant way. So this becomes, I think, part of our issue, is that what we then tend to define as a good church, or even living a good life, tends to be busy, and we take that on. Like, we usually, when someone says, "How are you doing?" your response is, "Well, I'm really busy," which is both a assertion of life going well for you. You know what I mean? Like, it's in some ways you're saying, like, things are too busy maybe, and I could be at risk of becoming really overwhelmed and burnt out and depressed because my life's so busy. But I'm also telling you that I'm really busy because, I'm in demand, and I have reach, and I have a lot of things going on. And at least that's how our lives were pre a pandemic, for sure. And so I think people feel the same way with their churches, that they actually want them busier than they can participate in. And I don't know if you've had this experience before, but I know a lot of youth workers who've had the experience of parents with their kids disappearing from youth group or confirmation or whatever for most of the winter because it's AAU basketball season, or because they're driving to Clemson to go to the games on Saturday or something and can't make it back by Sunday. And they're gone for those months. But then the email goes out from the youth pastor that says, hey, we just decided that families are too busy and we're not going to do youth group from October until March, until people come back. And then those very parents who won't have their kids involved at all are the ones who write back the email and are so angry that the church isn't going to have a youth group, even though their kid was never going to come, because they like the idea of being part of a church that was very busy and had this going on. So there's a certain way that this busyness just gets embedded in how we evaluate what's good. And I don't know if I'm getting at your question now, but yeah, we're just rambling and have a good time. But I think there is that kind of deep sense, and that's a very different way of practicing the Christian faith than this kind of sense of thinking of time as full of something, as opposed to thinking of time as something you can speed up and accelerate. And this is where Rosa and Taylor are connected, because Rosa thinks time keeps getting sped up. He doesn't talk about this much, but essentially he thinks, like Taylor, that time had to be hollowed out of anything sacred within it, so that it could be light enough that it could be accelerated and just continually accelerated. And that the big point where that starts is when you get good old Benjamin Franklin telling us and embedding in our consciousness that time is money. That time isn't full of the presence of God or full of a sacred reality. That time is money, and then therefore can always be accelerated.
That when you say that, my grandpa one time, and he was Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force, and when he retired, and he was retired for a long time and moved wherever my family lived because we were pastors. I was a pastor's kid. He had flexibility early in life because he was running a military in a war for years. And at one point in college, I said, Papa, you were so busy early in life, and now you're retired and you're even more busy because you got to have stuff to do. He goes, yeah, but you know what I learned in the second half of life? You never should be too busy. You can't scratch your balls. and that's immediately what I just thought of when you made the Benjamin Franklin quote. Because he used to joke, he's like, I just don't ever trust those Benjamin Franklin quotes. The guy got himself shocked by lightning. I could have told him that was a bad idea. In the book, in Kip's question, he brought up the section on the zombie congregation, and you talk about the kind of both and picture of personhood of Bonhoeffer. And after you talk about it, you say that the Volunteer Society contends that people are what they're interested in as open individual wills. And then the congregation that does this, right, gets people obsessed with programs, because if they're interested in the program, then that really matters to them, right? So you don't have to have gone to church for 5 months, but now that what you are interested in disappears, it goes away. And thinking back to the first time you were on the podcast, it derailed because you brought up Eberhard Jungel, one of my favorite theologians we have in common. One of the observations he makes about robust Protestantism is making a form-content distinction of the gospel, and that the church gets obsessed with itself, and it sees itself, and you get obsessed with the form, and then an institution wants to perpetuate the form, and then, right, what do? You are what you give your attention to. So what form can we give people the church in so they're attending to it? And his whole thing about the gospel is that it happens. And the content is the event. The event gives you yourself, it gives you the world, it gives you God all over again. And when you get obsessed with the form that may or may not have been life-giving in another context, and then that's what you're giving yourself to, because we have to do it better, and give more, so people want to give more attention to it and their assets and stuff, then you miss the fact that it was always what was harbored in these forms that mattered. And I wonder if there's a sense that underneath ministers that are stuck in the situation Kip's in, the ones you talk about in the book, is the struggle with like, where's the gospeling part of the gospel?
Mm-hmm.
How do you think the different social theorists that you're wrestling with give us that question back, or like kind of how would you restate Jungel's challenge we talked about previously in light of the conversation around social theorists and or even the Bonhoeffer piece that you talk about in that section?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, Trip, because like this whole 3-volume project kind of started with a kind of a Jungel brainworm where I can't remember where he says it. Maybe it's like in Theological Essays 1 or 2, one of those books. He talks about how he says something like so often the Christian church is obsessed with the process of faith more than the object of faith. And just thinking, I mean, Kip, you'll recognize this. I mean, it just feels like over the last decade, or at least 5 or 6 years, like the big kind of conversations in youth ministry have been all about like, how do you do the process? Like, how do you make the process work? How do you actually make faith, throw an adjective in front of it? Like, how do you make that work? And what's, of course, really ironic is no one ever talks about the object of faith in the midst of this, or how the object sets terms for what the process might even be. So it seems like everyone's running like, how do we keep the kids from leaving the church? What might be the process of faith formation to keep them coming? So that's, I mean, the kind of through line of a lot of this for me. And so, I mean, I think the whole project, like how the gospel becomes central within this, I probably become a bad Charles Taylor reader, and maybe closer to a Hartmut Rosa reader as this project goes on, because I'm just so much more of a Protestant than Taylor would. Though I think Taylor wants to ultimately say there has to be some kind of way of thinking of a kind of sacramental reality again, like even in a secular age. And it doesn't even need for him to have to be fully kind of religious, or for sure not institutionalized, kind of institutionalized religion. But there's got to be a way again that we have some kind of sense that the human being can encounter the infinite even within the finite. I think he has that kind of deep sense. And I do too. But what I always come back to is kind of this Bonhoeffer perspective that is a kind of Protestantized kind of view of that, which is the community or the relationships and the depth of the relationships in the community become that place where we encounter the living presence of God, which is why Bonhoeffer just thinks if the church becomes a volunteer society of people's interests, then you never actually encounter each other's humanity. You never actually encounter each other's personhood. And therefore, for him, you lose this deep sense of Jesus Christ existing as church community, or the sense of the very concrete personhood of Jesus Christ encountering us in the personhood of one another, and particularly the personhood of the neighbor. So at the end of the book, I'm trying to draw this out again and have that kind of connection that the event of encountering someone's personhood becomes the place where the concrete Jesus Christ becomes present to us, even in a secular age, which, I haven't done enough like actual qualitative research on this, but my just deep hunch is that you ask people where they felt like they encountered the living presence of God, and it usually is in the event of having someone's humanity near them who either they received ministry from or they gave ministry to. Like in that eventful encounter of giving and receiving the gift of being ministered to, there is something about the kind of return to transcendence, or the return of the encounter, the possibility of those times being kind of, time itself being fused with something sacred. So I use a story from a book about at the very end of this book. There's a story in a book about this practice that people have been doing with kids with autism, and how to kind of play this game with their child. And this author's talking about like being at a conference, and this theorist showing a video of it, and the whole room just becomes full of something as they watch this father interact with his son in this way, connect to his person over and against the impossibility that they felt to have this kind of connection. And the way the author describes it, a very secular author kind of talking about human development, really talks about it as this moment of the sacred breaking into time, that time becomes different, it becomes full of something. So I'm trying at the end of the book to trace back how we could get something full again, or something sacred in time, and kind of Bonhoeffer and personhood. And then this Orthodox theologian named Januarius is kind of gives us this sense of personhood being a significant dynamic where that occurs. The second thing I'll say, that's another project that I'm working on that has this kind of eventful quality, is there's just something really significant that's so hard for pastors in this dynamic, and probably Kip, you could probably assert is hard for youth pastors, is that to have this eventful encounter, one of the huge spiritual dispositions we have to have is to wait. Just to wait with people. And there's a certain quality in that waiting. There's a certain kind of relationship we have, which Rosa would call resonance. There's a sense of being together and being alive with each other. But I do think there's a deep sense of waiting that is really significant. And yet the way we kind of run our congregations and run our ministries when we feel like the haunting or the decline of secular 2 is going to get us, is the last thing you should do is wait, or the church will be done. And no good business in neoliberalism, again, Tripp, ever waits around. You just watch Shark Tank. The companies that win are the ones who are the quickest into the market. You know what I mean? You got to flood the market. And I think there's a very different kind of theological logic, kind of very different logic of Christian life to say that because this God is an event who arrives, and it is really a God who is God that we want to encounter, then the first disposition of our actions actually have to wait for this God and take on a form of action that waits.
Okay, so one of the things that immediately comes to mind when you say that is, and in the book you talk about how this type of acceleration, and then the kind of permanently deficient self, in a sense, that is the modern subject. The way our culture, technology, the drives that we internalize in modernity that are connected to success are ones where we're perpetually projecting the possibility of a future self that's finally whole, that we never get to because we permanently run dry and seek it out. It's just, if you could perform the idea of a good CV to your neighbor, then you're doing well, right? But it's always like what's on the cusp. And if you think of just, our previous conversation about just like what's known to us algorithmically, right? What works when you're selling things, having just finished a political season in a time where all businesses had to figure out how to sell to you on Facebook and Instagram, is to let you know that you're deficient, to remind you that your fears and anxieties are even more true than you imagine, to let you know that your conspiratorial thinking is just the first step of the big story, right? We need to give you a big story that's really true. Like, there's so many things that are successful if success is getting your attention and getting your allegiance, that begin by telling you the most true thing about you is you're not good, right? And so the subversive thing of the gospel, or that waiting bit, is that the anthropology of the church or of the body of Christ is one where the most true thing about each of us is that we're God's beloved. And that only happens when none of us are being driven, in a sense, by this logic of deficiency. And I hadn't connected those dots till you were saying that in connection to the book, but just thinking about a lot of the questions and conversations I've had with Kep about youth ministry, if you are, one, good at winning by the metrics, like I was as a youth minister, if you check my references, they're going to give you metrics I didn't think were that important, but I was like, I was good at improv comedy, know 4 chords on guitar, and have a theology degree. Of course I was a good youth minister, And then, but if you ask me, what I would give you names of people who are doing beautiful things in their lives, and they tell stories in the relationships. And Kep has that same question. I think most ministers do, right? You have this allegiance to institutions and things, but the thing that energizes you are when you've created space where no one had to perform anything, bring anything, and no one thought they were deficient, and beautiful things happen. So how do you, I don't know, because I was a youth minister, I'm confident the gospel has power in ways that if I hadn't been the person who was present when those things happened. But none of it had to do with my extroverted nature, the ability to come up with really weird games, or that I can hold someone's attention for 40 minutes with a whiteboard and talk about the Bible, right? Like, anyway, sorry. What do you think about that? How the anthropology that's implicit in kind of modern neoliberalism is Antichrist. And it should just be identified as that. It would just help everything a lot. I think it would help the clarity and task of ministry be more clear.
Absolutely. And I think that the embedded in that anthropology is a very deceptive form of action on what qualifies as good action. And so, one of the things that Rosa, one of the earlier kind of thinkers that Rosa's drawing from as a good kind of, contemporary Frankfurt School kind of theorist is the much earlier Frankfurt School theorist, Erich Fromm. And Erich Fromm has that really beautiful little book called To Have or To Be. And he talks about the difference between the kind of the being mode and the having mode. And one of the things Fromm says is that the kind of form of action that modernity gives us is it basically comes off of the Reformation and says all action's the same. And so the Reformation gives us all action being the same because all action is done before God. So it doesn't matter if you're a priest, a baker, a candlestick maker. It's all done now before God. And modernity was happy to take that kind of sense within itself, but then of course do away with the God part. And now all action is the same. And Fromm says, well, then all action is then, or good action becomes the expenditure of energy. And all action in one way or not is the expenditure of energy. So all action is the same. And so it doesn't matter if you're organizing your sock drawer or you're teaching fifth graders how to write a poem. Essentially, it's all the same kind of action. Now, we want to resist that, but that says there's something else within us. But for the most part, there's no other reason that action should be the same. Shouldn't be the same. So it's all becomes about the expenditure of energy, which then means that the best actors, this is kind of your anthropology part, Trip, the best actors are the ones who expend the most energy. Who's the best pastor? I mean, what's the best congregation? Those who are expending the most energy to have the most resources are the best. And yet I think what Fromm is getting at, and Rosa is particularly building on, is there is another form of action. And this is kind of what Kip was saying before, is that it's not just about slowing down. That won't really do the trick. Rosa thinks what you need more than just slowing down is you need a different kind of sense of action. And he thinks there's another form of action we have that isn't just about expending energy, but it's actually feeling connected, feeling in dialogue with the world, feeling alive. And if we can take on that kind of form of resonance of feeling connected to the world, where our relationships to one another and to the world itself aren't instrumentalized, which is what kind of neoliberal late modernity wants to do, what every friendship on Facebook is kind of turned into, especially as it tries to sell you things, is it tries to instrumentalize that. If we can get back to some kind of sense of relationships that aren't instrumentalized, but actually are experiences of resonance, then waiting becomes something significant. Waiting becomes full of something. And waiting isn't just wasting time, but waiting is participating deeply in each other's lives as we yearn for and pray for the salvation that we need, that tries to reflect the depth of our connection to one another. So it is just a very, it's a problematic anthropology that even goes back to kind of a problematic sense of what counts as legitimate forms of action. And I think so many Protestant pastors, at least, what is legitimate forms of action is expending a lot of energy, which is why what Will Willimon wrote 30, 40 years ago, a book about pastors and burnout. Like, burnout has been a huge issue for pastors because we have a false kind of theological anthropology that goes back to a kind of false sense of even what qualifies as legitimate human action.
Yeah. Kip, do you have a...
Yeah, so, Andy, you talk a lot about, at the end of this book, that the church to find resonance with the church that carries its children. And I have a very, very unique and privileged background to where, and I was Baptist, so some of these milestones we'll have to massage. I was dedicated, baptized, ordained, buried my mom, and married my sister all in the same building, and was able to work as a professional minister in my home congregation for 7 years. So, my experience of the church was one that carried its children and, me, and grew up knowing everybody in the building, knowing everybody in the pew. And as we've continued to do youth ministry in post-modernity, the 21st century, I think the church has lost that the programs that used to be the meeting space, the space that individuals came to connect over resonance, the main thing is no longer the main thing. And Trip, you talked about the gospel. We now are more focused on the form and function than the actual gospel itself. And, Andy, I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts on, I think somewhere deep back in the bottom drawer of our file cabinets, a lot of pastors kind of see this and feel this, even if we don't want to put or can't put words to it. To use C.S. Lewis, there's going to be some very serious descaling and a painful letting go of a lot of things for us to return to being a church that carries our children again. I'm thinking of churches in my hometown that have rock walls and Starbucks in their youth buildings. And I'm including myself in this. I do 10 overnight retreats a year as a youth minister. Like I'm the youth pastor that people, think is too caffeinated. But the reason I think we can't get to the resonance in being a church that carries our children is because for us to let go of our programs and our rock walls and the half pipes for skateboards we have in the back parking lot is first we have to admit that we were wrong and that these were incorrect venues and misinterpretations of the gospel. And the church, capital C, seems more bent on not being willing to admit where we have done wrong or wandered away from the gospel and doubling down on that instead of being a place where we can come and say, we are imperfect people in an imperfect world. And if the church can't do that and say, maybe buying a basketball gym wasn't how we bring people to Jesus, and a basketball gym is actually a pretty reasonable thing. There's a lot more or less reasonable things churches have purchased. Then how will we ever become a church that welcomes broken people into the doors and say, maybe I should have spent more time with my kids than working 67-hour weeks at the office. Fill in the blank of whatever sin you need to bring to the table. And I'm really curious what your thoughts are of how, as pastors and lay leaders, do we bring the church to a place where it can let go of some of those things to bring new life?
Yeah, I mean, the letting go thing is incredibly difficult, but it follows what we've been talking about, because I think if we can't have a way of thinking about a deeper kind of theological anthropology, like Tripp was saying, then we'll always get caught in that. And I think this is kind of the part that Bonhoeffer is going at, is that, the gym and the rock wall and the Starbucks in the church become necessary for ministry if you are a volunteer association. And there is a certain kind of assumption that people are free will kind of interest machines, and that you better have something. I mean, it is a competitive religious marketplace, right? Like, how many churches do people drive by on a Sunday before they pull into your parking lot to go to your church? Well, when we're not in a pandemic, how many do they, a lot, so how do you get them to go to yours instead of another? And we don't have these things like we used to have, like denominational loyalty that will keep people going, or anything like that. And then it's just, that even leads to the assumption that they're going to go to church at all on a Sunday, let alone just stay home and work on their fantasy football roster or something like that. So it feels really hard to give some of those things up, because you feel like it's the only way, it's the only tools you got to play the game. And of course, the game is you're only a good pastor if your church is growing, and you need to grow your church. And I heard someone said recently that they were always taught that only healthy things grow. And so churches should always grow if they're healthy. And I thought, well, what about cancer? Cancer is growing and it's not very healthy. And what about, like if you had a 4-year-old and your 4-year-old was, 6'8" and 350 pounds, you'd be nervous. Like that would be a problem if you had a 4-year-old that was growing at that rate. So just because it's growing doesn't mean it's necessarily healthy or good. But that is this kind of mentality. This is what Rose is talking about, kind of dynamic stabilization, where he's saying all late modern institutions, how do they stabilize themselves? Like, whether we want to be a nostalgia, whether this is too nostalgic or not, like medieval churches did not stabilize themselves dynamically. They stabilized themselves through the practices themselves. Like the practices and the fact that these were that this was bringing heaven to earth, these very practices were what stabilized the church. It didn't matter if people were in the cathedral or not. The priest was doing these things. And now we don't feel that way. Like at the little church my wife is a pastor of, when people don't show up, you feel this like, oh my gosh, this is going to all fall apart really quickly. So the way we stabilize any of our institutions in late modernity is they have to grow to stabilize. They stabilize dynamically, which is why any company that's not seeing whatever it is, 8 to 12% growth is going to die. Like it can just close its doors now. And I think pastors feel that same fear, that if we don't have the ability to stabilize ourselves through growth, then we will have no hope. And the only way to get I think pastors, we have to give them the credit, like pastors and denominational leaders don't actually think the most important thing is the climbing wall, or the most important thing is the youth room. Most of them don't. You may think of the exception, but most don't think that. But they also don't know how to play the game without having those things, or wishing for those things, or looking at the church across town and thinking, man, it would be easier if we had those things. But that is kind of Bonhoeffer's point of being sucked into this volunteer association. And I find it just fascinating. And in some ways, the whole book I've wanted the book to be about this, but it became about something else, is that I'm just kind of enamored with Bonhoeffer's Sanctorum Communo. And what almost no Bonhoeffer scholar ever references or talks about is how Bonhoeffer talks about what will show you that you're a life community or a volunteer association is the place of children within the community. And he does not mean that there's a big children's ministry with a stage and a giraffe or something. That will show that it's a volunteer society. What shows that it's a community of persons is a child being taken into the center of it. I don't think I ever fleshed that out well enough, but there's something really interesting in that. And for Bonhoeffer, what that reveals is the kind of operative anthropology you're living out of. And so, like, in the very end of Act and Being, he has this little section where he talks about the child as the eschatological form, that he thinks that what we're really always have to remember about ourselves. And he's writing this after spending a year in Barcelona, and he wrote a lecture while he was there about Jesus Christ as the inventor of childhood. He doesn't want to give childhood over to psychology or any of the sciences. He wants Jesus to be the one who invented childhood, and the Matthean text to be a kind of central theme in this. And for Bonhoeffer, that's so essential because it reflects the kind of creatures we are, that we are creatures who are distinct wills but always need others, that we are material bodies but also spirit, like that, in that a child embodies those realities most kind of primarily. And that ultimately, eschatologically, who are we? We are children of God, and we are siblings to one another, at least. And that's kind of how he's thinking in his early 20th century kind of form. So it is very interesting to think of children or young people as kind of theological litmus tests in how they are put at the center of our communities, more than thinking of the programs around them as billboard to get disinterested, mobile people to come to your congregation and to another, which is usually how they think. Like, I don't know, Kip, I'm totally reading into what you're saying, but like 10 retreats a year, I mean, why would I want to take my 13-year-old and 12-year-old to a church where they only have 8 retreats a year when we could do 10 retreats a year? I'm sure not every age group does those. You
get a lot of extra date nights if you can get rid of your kids that much.
Right. But if I find out my kid doesn't like it very much and doesn't like church, who's the first person I blame? Not me, not our family. I blame you. You're the one. If you could just make this fun, then, you'd make my life easier than trying to convince my kid to go. So, yeah.
Well, yeah. So, Andy, I think you're talking at such a level that I almost need like a pause button to process.
You're talking fast too, I'm sure.
Yeah. And, you
very accelerated.
Really, I think really important as the church looks at what we're going to be when we come out of COVID-19. Because this book is going to come out at an interesting time. I think is the publishing date January 21st? Is that correct?
Yeah, I was just told today they're going to tape a vaccine to the book. So if you want to get the vaccine, you have to buy the book. That's totally not true. I'm sure I will have the military at my house telling me not to say such things, but
Pfizer is sponsoring this book.
it's right. Congregation in the Secular Age, brought to you by Pfizer.
Yeah. But I think specifically, for any congregational leader, youth specifically, because you write about the church at large, but there always kind of is this youth ministry seems to be the home of your work, or maybe I'm biased and I want it to be, and I read that on it, that we're coming into the year of 2020 and realizing that things will never return to as they were, which is really a process the church is going to have to go through and to mourn and to grieve. And in a way, we get to reinvent ourselves again. Mm-hmm. And a lot of what you're talking about touches on Sebastian Junger. Am I saying that right? Book Tribe. He talks about children in his book, the difference we've seen in modernity and postmodernity of how Western European, and he includes Canada and the U.S. in that, Western white culture has changed the child's place in the community to, instead of like sleeping in the same room as mom and dad and always being there, that we go and put them off in these silos, and they develop these weird coping mechanisms like these odd attachments to stuffed animals, because we're launching them out into this future of individualism. And he doesn't touch on this, but he sets up the foundation beautifully. But by kind of removing the child from the community and putting them in their own bedroom, the day you bring them home from the hospital, and they have to self-soothe and figure out what it means to be human on their own. And Bonhoeffer touches on that as well with, the children can only have value outside the now, and we project them from the present into the future in a volunteer congregation. What we're doing when we do that is removing any narrative of the death experience that we can walk through together as a congregation. And I think the decision that the church has to make, and all of your work, and specifically the last chapter of this book touches on, is for us to have any future as a religious institution or the faith moving forward, we have to create a space where we're not projecting into the future of programs and practices and the tangible things, but being the space that sits in the present and in the now and waits and walks through the death experience with teenagers and children and families and anybody. And I think what's going to be hard for the church is that's really a crappy thing to market. Mm-hmm. Hey, post this on Instagram. Come talk about your crappy life experiences at my church. Don't you want to come to our Wednesday nights? And I'm curious what your thoughts are on how do we become the congregation that experiences, and your work refers to as the death experience, the walking through the valley with the congregation, holding the hand of the family who has cancer, or the single mother who just experienced a horrible divorce, or pick your poison, but not branding it as a pseudo self-help therapy, but a congregation that sits and waits with you.
Yeah, I mean, you're right about how do you advertise that on Instagram is nearly,
what filter do I use?
Yeah, right. Nearly impossible. But I mean, I think one of the things that I'm trying to push into with this book and in continuing to think about is sharing in the death experience, as we might say, or in the experience of suffering, can become dehumanizing if that becomes instrumentalized too. You know what I mean? Like if it becomes kind of mechanized in a certain way. And that there is a sense, I think, that what we're driving towards, and this is why I find Rosa so helpful, is that one of the things that we are trying to be as a community is a community of resonance. And resonance just isn't good feelings. Resonance is feeling alive. And sometimes in the midst of suffering, I mean, existentialists have kind of told us this for 80 years to 100 years, that there is something about feeling alive in the midst of feeling that you exist, in the midst of being able to deal with the realities of your void or whatever. And so one of the things Rosa wants to say is that resonance is not idealistic, that resonance is actually very dialectical in the sense that it does have this, it does suffer with. And, like his example is a kind of superficial one, but, you go to a movie and you come out of the theater and you're just sobbing, and someone says to you, "Are you okay? Did you like the movie?" And they say, "I love that movie." And it was an experience of suffering even watching the movie, but it also felt like it connected you to something deeper, that it connected you in a significant way with what it meant to live a human life, or with beauty or the fragility of our existence or something like that. And so I would never want to say that, like, to be congregations of the cross, to be congregations that wrestle with suffering, doesn't mean there isn't a deep dynamic of resonance with them. But the resonance is that, and I guess this is to kind of echo Luther's theology of the cross, is that there is this reality of sharing in the suffering of the cross can build experiences of resonance that connect us deeply to one another, that hold us together, that the experience of joy of shared life together, I think biblically, or at least in a kind of echo of Luther, like joy is the experience of finding life out of death. And I don't think you can market that, but I do think that testifies to something, that testifies to something actual and concrete, that in this community that we wrestle with death and take the joy of finding ourselves bound to one another through these experiences, and find ourselves encountering the living Christ as we confess these experiences. But there is a big move, and I'm new to this, but I've been reading a lot of Meister Eckhart of late, and for him, like, the move is, it's called like disattachment, but actually I think a better translation of it that another scholar has talked about is a letting go-ness. And this becomes something that's so hard, whether you're a pastor or you're just, to use Tripp's language again, a neoliberal parent trying to kind of get more and more into your whatever, get into some kind of dream for the future. Is we're not people who like to let go, to just let go of grievances that have happened to us, let go of past pains, let go of dreams that actually aren't that fulfilling at all, or let go of the haunting reality of getting to our dream and finding it didn't fulfill. That there is a kind of sense of what does it mean to kind of let go. And I think late modern people deeply want to figure out how to let go. And I think where Eckhart's going is that in the midst of letting go, you find, in the sense of this nothingness, a God who takes what's dead and makes it alive, or a God who takes and finds us in this kind of reality of nothingness. So there is something substantive. I mean, it is an experience of resonance, but it is very hard to put that on Instagram. And but maybe that's the whole problem to begin with, is that we feel that kind of competitive nature to advertise and to get people interested in coming, which, maybe in a sense that puts us in a rut we can never get out of until we allow that to kind of die within our expectations.
Do you think that has a lot to do with how temporality functions in modernity? In the book, when you talk about it, you talk about how the Inaris, is that how you say the guy's name? I don't.
Yeah, that's how I say it. I could be totally wrong. Yeah.
Well, it's officially how their name is said until they come on the podcast and clarify.
Right.
So Inaris clearly talks about the horizon of being, and it's bound in this communion of people. And this was kind of, it seemed to me, at least, didn't say explicitly, but a play on the way temporality functions in Heidegger, and then everyone that's wrestled with it since then, right? There is a sense that when the notion of the concept of the self is always worked out in your history, in your community, in your situation, and your materiality. And the question then, for Heidegger, is this one of authenticity, but in the book, it's this way in which you're going to relate to your past. You're going to relate to the horizon of the future, and then you're going to relate to yourself in the present. And then the question has to go, like, what do you gain from those three in the moment? And if the present is always deficient, then you're going to cling to things in your past, harms probably, or victories, and be like trying to drag them forward as justifications for the identity you're trying to project, right? And then you're going to do the same with the future. Whatever is missing in you, there's some promissory note there, or whatever's wrong about you, it's still going to be true there. And like, I am a failure, and I already know that because I'm speaking forth my future, right? And so I think there's a sense of like, you are in temporality, but what Meister Eckhart gets at, and it's been a while since I've read him, but he talks about how there's the flux on the surface, the imminent plane, but there's also this great underground river, right? And he talks about how, like, at occasions I got wet in a puddle of mud, and then it rains, and you tell all yourselves these stories of water, but there's this great underground river that no one can dam up. But if you're always obsessed with your temporal imminent plane access to things, then you're deficient. And it's kind of like I in a sermon one time I used the example of, how do you die of thirst in a monsoon? You forget you have a neck, right? And so much of modernity is like telling us you don't have a neck. You're like, how are you going to deal with your past? How are you going to deal with your future? What are you going to do in your present? We're not going to get access to this beautiful gift of the gospel, or this deep sense of affirmation, or these type of things. And I mean, I don't think you have to be a Christian to have access to the affirmation God gives all created things, but theologically speaking, but it happens in community. That's the other part of what Heidegger points out, and Yunaris points out that you highlight in the book, is that you learn how to relate to your past differently by other people seeing your past differently. You learn how to see yourself in the present differently when other people speak this truth to you differently. Anyway.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And I could be challenged on this, but I've been amazed over the last 4 or 5 years. What your thought made me think about is how many students of mine, maybe there's other reasons for this, but mention trauma. Like, trauma comes up as probably the most common word that my students now use, that they did, at least the word that they did not use 5 years ago, that comes up in every conversation now. And there's probably a lot of reasons for that. But I think one of the realities is, of course, they are traumatized. But one of the reasons they're traumatized is because they've had traumatic experiences, obviously. But there's also something about time within that. And I think that what you're hitting on, Trip, is like, when the present becomes so short that you can't even inhabit it, and you're just always pushed to the future, and then you don't know how to make sense of your past, that your past always is somewhat traumatic. And you don't have communities to kind of share and help you rewrite your past and not have to carry the burdens of it. It is quite a traumatic experience. And so, yeah, it's kind of where this book is trying to go. I mean, I really am trying to argue that modernity accelerates so quickly that the present becomes so short that we don't live in it, and that we're always kind of projected into the future. And then there becomes the event of personhood, and the event of community becomes really hard. It becomes, I mean, why can't you give up the Starbucks and the climbing wall? Is because you're thinking of future people who might want to come to the church, not the people who are there right now who need it, that we almost are projecting all of our goods into the future.
I would do it facilitating a tutorial. A bunch of different people will do the lectures, right? And then one of us in the class will be the facilitator for the discussion each week. And we were reading queer and feminist, eco-feminist critiques of religion. And the questions around trauma came up, and the other one that came up, and not just naming it, but thinking what is getting itself done, right, in the trauma discourse, was the triggering discourse. What was fascinating in it is that the students who, if you were going down the checklist of privileges that were very high, right, recognized they needed to be more sensitive about these issues because they haven't in the past. And then those that had, would have the least, especially on the way kind of identity politics functions, they had a discussion that struck me, and I don't even know what I think about this yet. This just happened, and I've been thinking about it. They said, well, sometimes when you're in a conversation and people are attentive to trauma and saying things that could be triggering and stuff, in a gracious way and not like a bemoaning way, then you realize they weren't really that necessary and important to begin with because you weren't under threat. And so in a culture where this type of the politics of identification reign, right? And so how I present myself and name my presentation gives to the other an obligation to recognize it as such, then there is this intense way you relate to your past and the possibilities, triggers, right? And you need this type of closure in order to protect your own performance of yourself. And you see how people in different privileges and lack of it express it. But underneath it, what was fascinating in the conversation was how when all the virtue signaling got done and when the test of trust in the conversation happened, they realized both those discourses weren't helpful because they were really trying to say, can I be myself here? Can I trust this space? And so I wonder what you think of that, because it's like, you don't want to not acknowledge trauma. You don't want to not give people the information they need to feel safe in a conversation. And if our past and our future are so limiting what we're attending to in the moment, you won't get to the type of affirmation that you want to happen.
Yeah, that you absolutely long for, which is,
but it was a philosophy of religion seminar at a secular university, so I couldn't go, all right, as a minister on the aside, I just want y'all to tell y'all I was thinking about this. But how trauma relates to the past, trigger warnings relate to the future, and they aren't needed when you trust the other person. And
you're really in the present with them.
Right.
And time becomes full of something else, like something good. Yeah. Yep.
I don't know if I get canceled for saying that, but I just feel like it was one of those moments where you're like, I don't even know what y'all are saying, but I like it. And I want to figure out why it's attractive. Yeah. So when you are wrapping up a trilogy, having spent all this time with a whole bunch of different social theorists, and then you got stuck in quarantine, which is its own phenomenological epoche for reflecting. What wins out for your vision of the life of the church future? Is it your optimism or your pessimism? What did that wrestling look like?
This is like a cop-out answer, but I feel torn, actually, having written this book, and then obviously the book was written before quarantine started, but have like the book in production and being kind of ready and knowing that it would be the kind of next book. Actually, the book that came out right after quarantine was Kip has been nice to mention it, was the End of Youth Ministry book, ? Which I was like, holy cow, I'm a prophet. Like, here it is. Like, youth ministry ended for most ministries, like at least for March and April, But I have thought like, am I a pessimist or am I an optimist? And I guess the cop-out answer is I feel like there's both an opportunity and there's a crisis here in the pandemic. And the opportunity is that we do have to kind of rework and help all people, congregations themselves, but also, families and others, rework what is a good life. And if it can't be just accruing resources for a future you don't even know if you have, particularly like if you can get your kid into that elite university, or there's no more traveling baseball, or there's no more, being able to go into the Spanish tutor that's going to get your kid into this university or whatever, all that stuff goes away. You now have to really rethink what is a good life. So that's a positive. The thing that I worry about, while there's a lot of good things that can still happen on Zoom, and we're talking in 3 different places in the world on Zoom, I do wonder if, and I do think what people need to have that full kind of sense of the now, Trip, are encounters with real persons in real bodies in real spaces. And there's less of that. And particularly people who are quite lonely are getting less of that. So I'm both optimistic and worry, and have some pessimism around that. And then there's all the secular fears too. When you're teaching in a seminary and you have a wife who's a mainline pastor, where you just think like, will anyone ever come back? Or will people, like the few people, like you started this with, Kip, will they just wake up and, March 15th and be like, I guess I don't miss not going to church and I'm never going to go back. Or so there's those worries as well.
Andy, it's funny that you bring up the End of Youth Ministry. So that book came out on March 17th. March 15th was.
I just want you to note that he remembers days your books come out.
I know. I'm amazed.
Well, here's why. The last time I was able to have my youth group in the building was March 15th. Yeah. And then 2 days later, Amazon drops off your book at the door. And I'm like, this is rude, Andy. That's what that is.
I know. We should have taken the question mark off because it was just.
Yeah, it should have been an exclamation point.
Right, exactly.
And now we're planning our 2021 year, and I'm realizing I'm not going to be back in the building on March 15th, most likely. So, and you mentioned Erich Fromm and the tension between to have and to be, and so much of modernity and Reaganomics and the 21st century is. As a society, we have intentionally, and maybe not purposely, but made the conscious decision to give up the bees so that we can have. And we keep losing the things that we can be for the more things that we can have. And in this season, we're meeting on Zoom right now from 3 different time zones. But what's missing in us being able to have this conversation is the ability for us to be together. And as a youth minister and any congregational leader, you recognize, I can still do Sunday school on Zoom, but those interpersonal conversations of how was the soccer game, how was how was the cross country meet, how was well, none of those are happening, but if they were happening, how was the play that the drama club put on last week? And we're realizing, at least on an academic level, and I hope that the church at large is as well, that the things that we have are not why we come to church. The things that allow us to be are why we gather together as a body. And the building just happens to be the meeting place for that.
Absolutely.
And Tripp asked, are you optimistic or pessimistic? I think my version of that question would be, with what you're doing and the reading and the research and being at a seminary and kind of, being at the county seat of congregational life, if you will, do you see the church when we return being an arms race of who gets to have, or being able to recognize what we've missed and being able to come together to be?
Gosh, it's such a great question. I could see it going either direction. I mean, I really could. I think the one thing that is going to happen is, maybe this won't happen for Tripp because he's such a extrovert, but I think those of us who are not extreme extroverts, it's going to take us a while to get our sea legs back of just actually being with people. Like, we're going to yearn to be with people and want to be with them. But my experience is that now when I am with people, even in a social distance way, it's like after 45 minutes, I'm exhausted. So that it's going to be interesting because we could see people really rush back to church and then feel overwhelmingly exhausted by it. So I think we're going to have to think about that in the context of ministry. And I think we need to have conversations about what this has done to ourselves and what we've thought about ourselves. And, I hope in a small way that this book and the way it talks about the self can function. Because it has been an interesting experience being on Zoom. Because they say one of the biggest engines of fatigue and Zoom fatigue is that, like, right now, looking at the two of you on Zoom, I cannot help watching myself. Like, there's just some kind of neurological inability to not watch yourself. So I'm watching myself I'm watching myself have a conversation. It's like I'm on a stage or something. It becomes really odd and it becomes exhausting. And so there are going to be ways coming out of this fog that we're going to have to learn to be together again and learn what it means to be. But maybe this is a good opportunity because we can slow down a little bit, or better, we can lean into really the resonant experiences. And maybe quality will become more important than quantity. And that hasn't always been the case in the cutthroat, decreasing religious marketplace of Protestantism, where it's always been the more is better, whatever that might be.
Oh my, you just now scared me, because I'm pretty sure I'm going to be the extrovert who the first time you're allowed back at church is going to break everyone's like bubble of space.
Right.
And be like, you just tell me when we've hugged too long.
Right. And people are going to be texting the pastor before, just like, will you let me know if Tripp's there? Because I just don't know if I can do a whole service if Tripp's going to be there talking to me the whole time.
Just gonna be like, do y'all want to have like 3-hour small groups twice a week just to catch up for a while, tell some stories? We should maybe like have cards. It's like extroverts. If y'all could go over in that corner.
Right. Yeah. There you go.
Oh yeah. That's great. So, Andy, thank you so much for hanging out.
Thanks for having me again on this trip, and good to see you both again and hang out and talk. It was great.
Awesome. Is there anywhere you want to send people on the internet?
Yeah, people can just find me on my website, which is andrewroot.org. Don't ask me why it's a .org, but it is. And you can find me there, and it'd be great if people could check out the book. And it's been great hanging out with you two.
Awesome.
Yowza! You made it all the way to the end of this episode. Clearly, you know what's up when it comes to hanging out with the Dr. Root. So head on over to OurSecularAge.com and join the class, this summer class, exploring the work of Taylor and Rosa with Dr. Root. OurSecularAge.com. Thank you for listening, and remember, share the brew.